Arriving in the sociology department at Florida State University, Charlie Nam found that one of his colleagues, Professor Charles M. Grigg, had organized an independent Institute for Social Research to support FSU colleagues and their work. Charlie Nam found this research institute a stimulating, supportive place to continue his analysis of census data and vital statistics, as illustrated by this article.
Well, in the 1960s and for a while later, FSU had an Institute for Social Research, which was headed by Charles Grigg. As the Institute developed, different subcenters were established, including one on population. Grigg was intent on circulating papers produced by faculty staff members. When Grigg retired in 1989, his institute and the research reports series were terminated. After this article was drafted and presented at a conference, Grigg asked that the article be included in research reports.
Charlie recognized, though, that agreeing to Professor Grigg's request to have his paper published in the local institute's series of research reports in the social sciences meant that this article would not enjoy the same level of publicity and public availability that might have come from publication in a national level journal like Social Forces, Social Biology, or Demography. For example, today, papers published in those more prominent journals can be found in major archival internet sites that provide electronic copies of everything published there. But the FSU Research Reports series has disappeared from most archival sources. Paper copies can be found in some library collections. The co-author of this article, Russell Thornton, was a sociology doctoral student at FSU when Charlie Nam involved him in the research and writing of the paper. In fact, Thornton completed his dissertation and was awarded his PhD in 1968, the same year that this article appeared in the Research Reports series.
Russell Thornton was a graduate student in sociology at FSU with a major area of the sociology of higher education and a minor area of demography. I got the idea for this article after reading an article by Raymond Pearl, a biologist at Johns Hopkins University who was involved in the establishment of the Population Association of America. Pearl referred in one of his articles to a mortality crossover of the races, but he did not elaborate. Thornton was a member of the Cherokee Nation and later wrote considerably on Native American demography. In fact, I think he might be the leading person in Native American demography.
After a long and productive scholarly career, Russell Thornton recently retired from the anthropology department at UCLA. In recognition of his highly respected publications dedicated to Native American population issues, he returned to FSU in 2001 as an invited guest speaker for the sesquicentennial celebration of the school's founding. This article was one of the earliest studies to call attention to a demographic pattern that, when we first encounter it, appears very strange and paradoxical. Even at the time, 2 generations ago, demographers were well aware that the most fundamental sort of life chances, that is, chances for life itself, chances to stay alive, were not shared evenly in any population. Risks of death are greater for disadvantaged groups in every society. Poor people have higher death rates and die earlier in life than do rich people. Black Americans have higher death rates than white Americans, starting from the moment of birth and continuing throughout most of life. But Thornton and Nam called attention to an odd exception to this systematic gap in life chances, a mortality crossover, an exception that appeared only in old age. Their Table 1 in the article presents death rates per thousand population for 10-year age groups from published vital statistics of the United States, separately for the white and non-white population of the country. At ages 55 to 64, and also at ages 65 to 74, we see the same pattern of higher risks of death for non-whites than for whites that we would find if we inspected any younger ages, all the way back to the start of life. But when we come to ages 75 to 84, the expected pattern of higher non-white mortality disappears. Instead, we see lower death rates for non-whites than for the white majority of the population. The death rates have crossed over. The survival advantage for non-whites compared to whites appears even larger for the oldest open-ended age group above age 85. This is the paradox that caught the attention of Thornton and Nam. It appeared not only in the most recent vital statistics available to them, centered on the year 1960, but it also reappears for every earlier decade all the way back to the turn of the century in 1900. This article does not mark the very first time that anyone had noticed the paradox of an old age mortality crossover, but Nam's careful search of scientific publications for similar work revealed only a couple of cases where other scholars had noticed the same thing.
Now, as I examined the mortality literature for references to mortality crossovers, I found the articles by Spiegelman and by Myers and Bayo, but nothing else. After this article was published in research reports, there was increased interest in the topic.
Over the following 60 years, the crossover paradox led to many subsequent efforts by other scholars to understand it. But in general, all of this later work has followed a basic distinction set forth in this article by Thornton and Nam. Either the crossover phenomenon was real and required some kind of explanation based on actual conditions of people's everyday lives as they grow older, or the crossover was some kind of illusion that might have resulted from problems with the underlying data used to calculate the apparent death rates. All published death rates, such as the figures shown here for U.S. women at ages 65 to 74 in 1960, depend on a combination of two kinds of information. Numerators of deaths that come from information on death certificates recorded in vital statistics, and denominators of people at risk of dying that come from census enumerations of the population. Each kind of these quite different data sources, in turn, are subject to two kinds of possible errors: coverage errors from overcounts or undercounts, and possible misstatements of ages, either on the death certificates or on the census form.
Questions were raised about possible errors in the underlying data that might affect the crossovers. Data errors were possible in several ways. There could be misstatement of age by persons. There could also be underreporting of deaths for non-whites at older ages in particular. And there could be under-enumeration of population. Several studies indicate that the effects of the first two error sources are minimal and would not affect the crossover. Under-enumeration of the population could have a more serious impact. As a consequence, we used Jacob Siegel's adjusted population estimates by age, sex, and color and recalculated death rates for both 1950 and 1960. We discovered that the adjusted data changed the death rates a bit, but did not affect the crossover either.
If people report inaccurate ages, for example, these errors always inflate population counts at older ages. No bias toward exaggerating ages is needed. Even simple random reporting errors count too many people at older ages. As a simple illustration, suppose that for all age groups, 5% of people randomly report themselves in the wrong age group, shown as the red subtractions from each age range. Half of them appear in the next older age group, and the other half appear instead in the previous younger age group. Because each older age group is so much smaller than the previous younger one, these equal splits of misreported ages affect the adjacent older and younger ages very unequally. In this case, for example, 132,000 people disappear from the 75 to 84 age group. Half, or 66,000 of them, appear at ages 65 to 74 instead. The other 66,000 appear at ages 85 and older. But the huge difference in the populations of these neighboring age groups means that the 5% of people lost from ages 75 to 84 only add about 1% to the younger 65 to 74 ages, but they add over 11% more people to the smaller population at ages 85 and older. This imbalance affects all ages where such random misstatements could happen, but the impact gets largest at the oldest ages where the differences in population by age are the greatest. Having too many people in these denominators could make a death rate look lower than it actually was. Demographers and actuaries already had been exploring these data quality issues by the time that Thornton and Nam wrote this article and were calculating various possible adjustments to account for possible distortions in death rate calculations. If we set aside the data quality issues, then, we have to come back to the fact of the black-white mortality crossover that appears consistently in U.S. death rates at older ages. It appears across all observed decades, and it appears for both men and women. What could be causing this old age crossover in death rates if it is real and not an artifact of data issues?
Well, if errors in the data did not affect the crossover, then we reasoned there may be some type of selection during the life cycle which affects white and non-white populations differently. Since non-whites have higher death rates at the earlier ages, it seems reasonable to assume that those non-whites who survive earlier ages are a hardier group going forward. At the same time, whites who survive earlier years include many who are not very hardy.
Thornton and Nam were among the earliest proponents of this idea that higher death rates in one group than in another early in life would select out a larger share of the most vulnerable, frail people in the disadvantaged group, leaving a hardier underlying distribution of frailty as a potential protective factor in that group later in life. They pointed out, though, that stronger selective pressure of mortality by itself would not guarantee the appearance of a mortality crossover in later life. For example, while they show us such a crossover for Black and white Americans, there is no such crossover for men compared to women. Men simply have higher death rates than women at every observed age, from birth to the oldest ages. Thornton and Nam insisted that the crossover comes from a combination of physiological differences in frailty with systematic social and economic inequalities between studied groups.
Well, the selection can be biological in the sense of health and medical conditions, but can also be social in the sense of living conditions, typical behavioral patterns, and the like. It seemed to us that biological and social factors interact with each other. Males and females in a population are likely to have more similar biological and social environments, so no selection takes place between the sexes.
This idea of selection acting with different intensities on different groups in society stimulated a massive expansion of related research in subsequent decades, spreading from demographers and biologists into clinical medical research and other disciplines. The argument depends on the existence of such an underlying distribution of innate frailty in a population, so it is hardly surprising that today extensive efforts have been made actually to measure and quantify such vulnerabilities in what are now called frailty indices. It is striking to observe, though, that such measures and calculations of frailty scores concentrate overwhelmingly on studies of older people in society. Little attention is paid to possible differences in frailty earlier in life. Jim Boppel called this the heterogeneity of frailty. And he said there's an underlying frailty distribution in a population.
Yes,
And if you select out all the frail people, then the hardy people are left.
exactly.
But what about the idea that made Jim Boppel rather uncomfortable, that frailty may be acquired as an ongoing process during the life course? That is, if you live in bad situations, maybe more frail people are selected out, and then more people are made frail after that. Is frailty once and for all at birth, or is frailty something that can be acquired and changed over the life course? What do you think?
Well, I think we're talking about populations, and some people who are more frail might continue to be frail, but others might become frail later on.
It seems safe to say that the research topic of mortality crossovers appearing or not appearing late in life for compared groups has become more and more important in the decades since this 1968 article. Still, our understanding of the issue and our ability to do anything about it face a wide array of ongoing theoretical and methodological challenges. Another of today's major research subjects in which Charlie Nam was present at creation.